Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this online seminar on the long history of the Mizrahim, a book that was published originally in Hebrew, Historia Arucha shel HaMizrahim, a new direction in the study of Jews from Muslim countries, a book, a festschrift in honor of Professor Yaron Zur, that many of you, at least those who are interested in the history and culture of the Jews of the Arab world surely know, since he has been for many years a professor at the University of Tel Aviv and is a prominent scholar in the field. I'm very happy to have a panel of scholars and colleagues from Israel, Europe, and also the US that will discuss the book in honor of Professor Zur, and then also their own research and how this connects to Professor Zur's work and to the field of Mizrahi studies on one side, and Sephardi studies and the history of the Jews of the Arab world more generally. The panel, the event is divided in two parts, let's say. We will have three, more precisely. We will have an introduction to the discussion that will be conducted by Aviad Moreno and Noach Gerber, that I will now introduce, that are two of the four editors of the book, together with Esther Meir Glitzenstein and Ophir Schiff. Then we will have a panel with the participation of 5 speakers that I will introduce later: Harvey Goldberg, Daniel Schreiter, Emanuela Trevisan-Semi, Jessica Marglin, and Ethan Katz. And lastly, the concluding remarks by Professor Zur himself, and then also hopefully a Q&A session. Let me start by introducing Aviad Moreno and Noach Gerber. So Aviad Moreno is a faculty member at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and head of the Research Hub Israel and the Jewish World at the Israeli Center for Israel Studies in that university, that is also one of the co-organizers of this event. Before joining the faculty, Aviad was a fellow at the Herbert Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies and a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies in the United States, and at Tel Aviv University, where he worked with Professor Zur. Aviad's research focuses on the ties between Middle Eastern and North African Jews in Israel, Western Europe, and the Americas. And among his publication is the book Europe from Morocco, the Minutes of Tangiers Jewish Community, published by the Ben-Zvi Institute Press. And lastly, he's been nominated recently a foreign member of the Spanish Royal Academy, so Mazal Tov, Aviad. And then secondly, Noach Gerber, who teaches modern Jewish history at the University of Tel Aviv, focusing on the Mizrahim and Jews in Muslim lands, and who also worked with Professor Zur. Noach, he's co-editing a forthcoming volume with the University of Pennsylvania Press, Frontiers of Jewish Scholarship, Expanding Origins, Transcending Borders. I didn't say it at the beginning, sorry, but most of you know that already, I guess, but I'm Dario Miccoli, and I teach modern Jewish studies and Hebrew at the University of Venice Ca' Foscari, from where I'm speaking now. So again, thanks everybody, and I'll give the floor to Aviad Moreno and then to Noach Gerber.
Okay, thank you so much, Dario, for this lovely presentation. Good evening, everyone. It is really heartwarming to see so many friends and colleagues who gathered in tribute to Professor Yaron Zur. I'll speak a little about the book. The Long History of the Mizrahim, is emblematic of the conceptual shift the entire field of Sephardi Mizrahi studies has undergone in recent years in general, and of Professor Zur's scholarship more specifically. Our observation about the methodological isolation of the largest group of Jews from Islamic countries since the 1970s, the Mizrahim in Israel, um, from the pre-immigration histories in what shaped the idea for the book, as well as its structure and the main questions. Um, what is the reason for this academic divide? This is what we asked ourselves. And one way of addressing this question is by reflecting a little bit on the inclination to analyze Jews from Islamic countries against all-inclusive hegemonic entities. You all know that in Israel's early years, the main motivation for studying Jews from Islamic countries was functional, to understand their position as ethnic minorities within the national melting pot, as in many other immigrant absorbing societies, of course. But this nationalist motivation left little room for exploring their minority status in non-Israeli context, including in the new communities in Europe and the Americas. This scholarly motivation, of course, changed significantly from the 1970s onward, with the cultural turn and the post-colonial turn that followed it in the humanities and social sciences, a turn that severely challenged the nationalist framing of ethnic groups and celebrated instead multiculturalism and hybrid identities. Um, as a consequence, by the 1980s, Mizrahim in Israel were being probed as minorities within the larger context of non-Jewish racial and cultural hierarchies in the post-colonial world, and of civil rights protests in North America and beyond. This reframing of Mizrahim as underdog within the global system of Western hegemony that included now Ashkenazi European Jews in Israel, did not pair smoothly with the long-lasting tendency to study Jews as minorities within non-Jewish environments. And when it came to Jews in Islamic countries, as I guess you all know, Jewish studies scholars usually preferred to analyze their minority status vis-a-vis Islamic political and religious majority across the Middle East and North Africa. But the cultural and post-colonial turns further complicated the picture. Scholars of the Middle East and North Africa equally framed Muslims as underprivileged minorities within the global system of Western hegemony. And the analysis of Jews as underprivileged minorities in Islamic society was thus obscured under this framework, and they were often associated with colonizer, the oppressing colonizer. Now, the book reflects a significant conceptual change taking place in the last few decades that bridges the different conceptual framing of Jews from Islamic countries or in Islamic countries as minorities against one single hegemony. For example, one of the book's main intervention is that it focuses on intra and intergroup power relations among dynamic communities of Jews from Islamic countries across national, colonial, post-colonial, and even social linguistic context. Daniel Schotter's article in the first section of the book is actually a great example. Rather than limiting himself to analyzing Moroccans vis-a-vis Ashkenazim in the Jewish state or Moroccan Jews under Islamic or colonial rule, it traces first the self-assertion among Moroccan Jews as an exceptional group within the larger Middle East and North African society, Jewish society, of course. And secondly, he explores how this self-assertion shifted from the Moroccan context to the Israeli multi-ethnic environment. The remaining 8 articles in the opening section of the book also defy common analysis of Mizrahi ethnicity while pitting them against local and global East-West binaries and the related dichotomies such as secular, religious, traditional, modern, center, periphery, and so on. Now, moving to the second section of the book, as mentioned, Jewish migration in the Middle East and North African context was explained through a variety of lenses that analyzed Jews as minorities vis-a-vis a specific hegemonic entity. They were thought to be driven out by oppressive Islamic regime, or alternatively, uprooted by Western powers or the Ashkenazi establishment in the Jewish state. But this left little leverage for analyzing the various migration processes, as the six contributions in the second part of the book show. They look, for example, at transnational Yemeni networks in the Red Sea and ties between the city of Afula in northern Israel and Tunisia, and many other examples. Along these lines, instead of studying Jews, Middle East and North African Jews versus all-inclusive regional entities, in the last section of the book, the studies look at them as multi-layered societies that shape their identities in constant interaction with multiple groups within and beyond the region. Now, Jessica Marglin's article is a wonderful example. She offers a really valuable case study of the encounters between traditional and modern legal systems across the Mediterranean, connecting Livorno and Tunisia. Her conceptual framing and the sources she uses, of course, connects the study of European and North African Jews from a non-traditional trans-regional perspective. Another very crucial intervention in this regard is, I think, Eitan Katz's analysis of the path to Jewish resistance to Vichy occupation of Algeria. Drawing on Yaron Tzur's sectorial paradigm, Katz explained the insurgency in Algiers as the product or the byproduct of the Jewish subculture within the wider European sector of Algerian society. So such analysis helps him move beyond the question of how Jewish the underground was. He frames it within the broader colonial context. These are just a few of the many complexities that the book highlights while attempting to capture the recent diversification of research trends in the field. This book is dedicated to Yaron Tzur, to Professor Yaron Tzur, who pioneered the straddling of the study of the history of Jews from Muslim countries with that of Mizrahim in Israel, as he began to take more nuanced to ask more nuanced questions about the internal structure of Middle East and North African Jewish societies. My sincere thanks to my co-editor Noach Gerber, Esther Meir, and Ofer Schiff. And I'm also very grateful to the Ben-Gurion University Press editorial staff, Oren Kalman, Smadar Rotman, Yael Dekel, Adas Blum, and many others. And the funds that have supported this project, Mifal Pais, Eric and Edith Sidey Charitable Foundation, and the Azrieli Foundation. Okay, and last but not least, I really like to thank Dr. Dario Micoli for initiating and co-organizing this event with me. Thank you all. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Good evening. Do you hear me? My sincere thanks to Dario Micoli as well for organizing this event. And in following up on Aviad's remarks, I wish to briefly reflect on the changing circumstances of Hebrew cultural affirmation in the academic field of North African Jewish studies, as well as on the language's function as a minority language in a non-Israeli context. For that purpose, I too will tap on the volume, some of its articles, and on the work of its honoree, Yaron Tzur, in steering forward younger practitioners in the field. In the early 1890s, the Maskil of Mogador, Yitzhak ben Yais Halevi, published serialized reports entitled "Amongst Our Faraway Brethren," quote unquote, in the Warsaw Hebrew daily Hatzvirah. A recent examination of this ethnographic treasure trove appears in Andre Levy's Return to Casablanca, in a chapter subtitled Surfacing Memories of Suppressed Colonialism. Ironically, Levy claims he had been introduced to Ben Yais Halevi by Michel Albipo, who by the 1980s was an entrenched Hebrew University representative of a colonially molded French historiography of North African Jews. Back then, as Yaron Tzur has taught us, native Hebrew literati curbing the enthusiasm of various civilizing missions in their midst stemmed from a collective scholarly need to soften the effects of Abitbol's own gaze on the subject. During the decade in question, the 1980s, Joseph Schreiter took up this challenge by producing a biobibliographical mapping of the terrain of a North African Haskalah, unwilling to yield before a French cultural onslaught. Daniel Schroeder assessed Ben Yais Halevi himself not only as a Hebrew maskil, but also as a Moroccan reformist amongst the more Western-minded merchants of his community. Tzur's foray into Tunisia led to a variety of maskilic concurrences turned critiques of Tanzimat-spirited reforms, a dominant Italian cultural presence, a French Jewish civilizing mission, the Alliance, and finally, a French protectorate. In the latter context, Tzur identified a unique Hebrew and Judeo-Arabic diglossia at work. This decade of discovery of North Africans' homegrown maskilim had essentially been inaugurated with the work of an anthropologist, Harvey Goldberg's critical edition of Mordechai HaKohen's History of Libyan Jewry. In comprehending the significance of the long history of Mizrahim and this evening's panel, I wonder whether a Hebraic gaze is looming once again on the horizon. Here in my hometown of Jerusalem, the Ben-Zvi Institute recently hosted a 3-day academic affair of Masortiyut, complete with Hebrew booklets, compliments of the local chapter of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, or Kol Yisrael Chaverim, which essentially offered the soothing wisdom of North African and Mizrahi rabbis. Should such a trend, I ask, have any bearing on the academic field we are discussing this evening? In recent years, Tzur's own path-breaking work on Morocco has been complemented by David Gedge's refreshing perspective on French Algerian educated rabbis generating confluence rather than conflict between Hebrew and French on Moroccan soil. From the long history of Mizrahim, the volume we co-edited, we now have Yuval Harovi's methodological warning that generic models of Sephardi rabbinic openness should be tested on local ground in modern Muslim contexts. In light of the above, any Hebraic perspective, I would think, should be subject to critical audit. Jessica Marglin's Mediterranean probing of the last will and testament of Nisim Shmama goes well beyond the context of Mishpat Ivri. Eitan Katz's framing of the Jewish underground in Algiers in the colonial theater of the Second World War reminds us that there is a lot more to the question than Misho Alit Kuma. Different geocultural perspectives, including that of our Italian hosts, not to mention cross-disciplinary wisdom generally, would seem to matter now more than ever. Thank you, and I too look very much forward to our panel.
Thank you, Aviad and Noach, for this introduction. And we will now move to the speakers and co-authors and authors in most cases of the book that we are discussing today. I will start by introducing them. So the first speaker is Professor Harvey Goldberg, who is emeritus in sociology and anthropology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Harvey Goldberg's work focuses on the social history of Jews in North Africa and on ethnic and religious identities in Israel. His initial research in the 60s was in an Israeli moshav of immigrants from Tripolitania. And as Noach just reminded, Professor Goldberg later edited and partially translated from Hebrew an account by Mordechai HaKohen of Jewish life in Libya. And Professor Goldberg is more generally a scholar that combines anthropology with Jewish studies and history that, if I may add, together with most of the, or all, if not all, I guess, the scholars that are here today, anyone who works in these fields has cited at least once in his or her work. The second speaker is Professor Daniel Schreiter, who is Amos Diner Memorial Chair in Jewish History and Professor of History at the University of Minnesota, where he serves as Director of the Center for Jewish Studies. His work include The Sultan's Jew, Morocco, and the Sephardi World, and another book, Merchants of Essaouira, Urban Society and Imperialism in Southwestern Morocco. He is completing now a book together with Omar Boum on Morocco and the Holocaust that is entitled The Story of King Mohammed V Saving the Jews During World War II. The third speaker, and then I will stop here and I will introduce the rest afterwards. The third speaker is Emanuela Trevisan Semi, who has been teaching here at Ca' Foscari for decades and who is now senior researcher at Ca' Foscari of Hebrew and Jewish studies. Professor Trevisan has coordinated the Erasmus Mundus Crossing the Mediterranean and has published many books on contemporary Karaites, the Jews of Ethiopia, the Jews of Morocco. For example, Les Karaïtes, Un autre judaïsme, Judaizing movements together with Tudor Parfit, Jacques Fetlovich and the Jews of Ethiopia. And in 2011, with the Hanan Sekat Hatimi, Mémoire et représentation des Juifs au Maroc, les voisins absents de Meknes. And lastly, Tamrat Emanuel, an Ethiopian Jewish intellectual between colonized and colonizers. I will give the floor to the first of these three speakers, Professor Harvey Goldberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. Thank you for the invitation to the seminar. Thank you to Aviad, Noach, and the other two editors. And thank you to Yaron for so much that I have learned from your writings over the years. My remarks take off from the introduction by Aviad and Noach that points to different disciplines, their orientations, and some of their blind spots. My concern, obviously, is with anthropology and history. It is no secret that the first paradigm to be formulated by sociologists in Israel downplayed the importance of history. In a 1950 paper on the Oriental Jews in Palestine, Shmuel Eisenstadt claimed that the successful integration of Jews from Europe into the Yishuv stemmed from the relative neutralization of ties to their societies of origin. This continued to be the stance emanating from the Hebrew University's Department of Sociology for the next 2 decades, but it is not without its inner complexities. The founding father of that department, in fact, was Martin Buber, who settled in Jerusalem in 1938. About 30 years earlier, within the young Zionist movement, Buber had called for the development of a Jewish science, a kind of sociology of Jewish life. He envisioned this discipline as different from Jewish Wissenschaft that took shape around 1820, which was based on text and oriented to the past. Jewish science was to be focused on life, both the present and potential futures. Buber was no stranger to the study of the past, of course, but may have sensed a conceptual and experiential fault line separating the disciplinary emphases. At that period, the turn of the 20th century, a major shift was taking place in anthropology. In different thrusts, the field turned away from what was later labeled as conjectural history. In 19th century paradigms, data collected in recent times provided the basis for reconstructing how human society evolved in its early stages, without giving any idea of a real chronology. The abandoning of evolutionist theories was somewhat different in the US and in Great Britain. In the United States, Franz Boas cogently critiqued evolutionary schemes that depicted all societies moving through the same stages. Early hypothesized society could not be directly documented, and evolutionism ignored the common sense mechanism of change, societies having impact upon one another. Even though written records were sparse regarding Native Americans, Boas insisted that historical study was needed to determine how diverse social forms actually developed. In Britain, the separation from a speculative, not to say fantasized past, took a different form. It was linked to functionalism, a notion that privileged synchrony over diachrony. It may be noted that this roughly was the same time that the notion of synchronic descriptive linguistics, in contrast to history-oriented philology was taking root. Field anthropologists with an empiricist bent now analyze the data they gathered in terms of the current wider field and context in which they appeared. Viewing cultural practices as remnants of past imagined historical phrases was a misplaced effort. From then on, a history-ignorant approach to fieldwork informed British anthropology, which also, by the way, called itself comparative sociology. And this continued till around mid-20th century. At precisely that period, the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Hebrew University's Department of Sociology was coalescing. Some of its founding and early members spent time in London and Cambridge studying with eminent English social anthropologists. World War II had pushed some anthropologists on both sides of the Atlantic to engage in studying cultural and social change, but fledgling Israeli sociology still encountered a theoretical milieu that did not basically challenge its disinterest in the history of immigrants. When I, trained an American anthropologist, first encountered Eisenstadt's 1956 book, Absorption of Immigrants, that sociologized history by classifying immigrant backgrounds into traditional, transitional, and modern, it appeared to me as a version of the evolutionary theory that my discipline had rejected. I felt no need conceptually to categorize people from Tripolitania whom I met in terms of modernization or any other scale. Instead, I was meeting a new world, partially familiar because its inhabitants were Jewish, and partially intriguing because their background was so different from my own, a world that I eagerly wanted to explore. With time, I also came to understand that there were points of contact between my training and perspective and the sociology existing in Jerusalem. The fact that easily is overlooked is that another foundational faculty member in the sociology department was Yaakov Katz. He also was attached to the Jewish history department, where apparently tension continued because the pioneering approach to social history that Katz developed was not accepted by senior colleagues there. Katz's work continued to focus on Jews in Europe, but his model of a traditional society did evoke the interest of researchers paying attention to immigrants from the Middle East. Shlomo Deshen, known for his fieldwork among Jews from Jewry and his historical monograph on the Melech Society in Morocco, explicitly identified with Katz's contributions. But he, along with Moshe Shoked, who also first studied in Jerusalem, felt that they had to leave there and do doctoral training in England in order to conduct research among Muslim lands immigrants through an anthropological perspective. Another barely noticed wrinkle emerged in the put history aside paradigm of Jerusalem sociology. It stemmed from the basic research mode of anthropology, which is fieldwork. The functionalist theorists in the mid-20th century Britain were also paragons of field research. Two multi-researcher projects under Eisenstadt were active in Jerusalem in the 1950s. Research on kibbutzim, led by Yonina Talmon, and on new moshavim, directed by Dov Weintraub. In both cases, fieldwork was the main mode of gathering data. Weintraub's work as a rural sociologist conceptually grew out of the absorption of immigrants paradigm. But if one carefully reads his summarizing book, Immigration and Social Change, he also points out historical factors that were important in individual case studies when these seem to be important. I include with an anecdote that somewhat decenters the Jerusalem focus. There was an American anthropologist, as elder colleague, Walter Zenner, who linked his 1950s fieldwork among Aleppan Jews, both in Brooklyn and in Jerusalem, with a detailed look at their history, including rabbinical writings. Walter was born in 1933 in Nuremberg. Educated in the States, he did a rabbinical degree at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the JTS, and also a PhD in anthropology at Columbia. Shlomo Deschen teamed up with Walter in editing two overlapping books in English that collected papers on Middle Eastern Jews, in which many of the authors were anthropologists. I also credit Walter with a wake-up remark he once made to me when I described to him my doctoral project in the mid-1970s. I see you too are doing Moshavology, he commented. This, along with some other incidents, made me realize that I had been ignoring that the Moshav farmers were Jews, or more precisely, that I was taking their Jewishness for granted, not an interesting question. That realization moved me toward my postdoctoral project, a historical ethnological pilot study of Jews from Tripolitania, many of whom were concentrated in Israeli Moshavim. And following that, an initial plunge into the Mordechai HaKohen, which was just mentioned. HaKohen also had paid close attention to the Jewish communities in Tripoli's hinterland. To me, the complementarity of these lines of investigation has always been obviously and crucial. The rest, if I may presume to say so, is history. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Harvey, for this fascinating fresco of Israeli anthropology and history, and how your research relates to all that. I will now pass to the next speaker, Professor Schreiter. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Dario, for the introduction, Aviad for organizing this symposium on the book. When I first reflect on how I might contribute to this volume of studies to honor my friend and colleague Yaron Zur, I came to realize how much Yaron's own research and teaching is both paralleled and inspired my own. Yaron understood very early on that so little was known or studied about the modern history of the Jews from Islamic countries, and the studies that did exist were problematic, often told as a story of persecution in the modern Arab world, the impossibility of integration of Jews into the new or emerging states. And this led inexorably to the mass immigration to Israel. And I would say, you know, Harvey could certainly vouch for this, that this was more or less the state of the field in the 1970s. So this book really, I think, is such a tribute to how far this field has come and the influence that Yaron has had in pushing research in new directions. So perhaps with the risk of repeating already some of the insightful comments that have been made by in Aviad's introduction and Noah's comments, as well as Harvey's portrayal of the field generally, I'd like to dwell for a moment on the title of the book, or perhaps what is meant for me. Mizrahim, of course, is a complicated category. I need not tell this to all of you present here today. A category that's often used synonymously with Jews from Islamic countries. Of course, it also sometimes includes, or often includes, other non-European or non-Western or non-Ashkenazi Jews. But of course, the term Mizrahim to large measure was an identifier for Eastern or Oriental Jews in Israel, but is also used, although somewhat unevenly, to refer to the global diaspora of Jews from Muslim countries. So this framing of Jews from Islamic countries as Mizrahim was part of a classificatory logic in Israel that implied that there was a certain commonality between non-Ashkenazi Jews who were lower in the social hierarchy. But it has also become a category used in scholarship and Jewish studies and other fields more generally, not only in Israel, but also worldwide. So thinking about the other part of the title, the long history of Mizrahim, and placing the stress on long is, of course, intentionally anachronistic, for it is a recognition that the Jews from Muslim countries had a history before they came to Israel. Popular conceptions about Mizrahim in Israel, however, would suggest that they either were a backwards people without a history, or a kind of collectivity whose history only really began in Israel with their experience of discrimination. So this misconception, I believe, has been at least in part driving the kind of historical research that Yaron is undertaking and advocated for. And I think that this is reflected so well in this collection of studies. But I'd like to also focus for a moment on what is meant to me by the long history. One might assume that this would include a history that would begin with the early Islamic centuries, but the medieval history of Jews from Islamic countries is missing from this volume. And in the historiography of Jews under Islamic rule, the study of Jews in medieval Islam has traditionally been a much more developed field. Yet it has been mostly disconnected from the long history referred to in the studies we are discussing. This disaggregation of the medieval and modern, I would suggest, also as a history that is connected to a theory both in scholarly and popular discourse of decline of the Jews and their rich culture in the Muslim world at the end of the Middle Ages. The Mizrahim, to use the term, were therefore much like orphans, disinherited from their ancestors' legacy. And a legacy, of course, which in Jewish studies and Jewish history generally is often represented as the kind of pinnacle of civilization in the pre-modern Jewish world. So I think Yaron's work and the contributions in this book, of which I include my own, are in a sense a response to this orientalizing and marginalization of the modern history of Jews from Muslim countries. Now, Yaron might want to correct me on my assessment, and perhaps I'm projecting a little bit too much from my own work and motivations. But this is how I at least have drawn inspiration from Yaron's work. Yaron, in tracing the commonalities of this long history of Jews from the Islamic world, begins in the 18th and 19th centuries before colonialism, with a focus on North Africa, especially Tunisia, and its interconnections with the Ottoman world. The 18th century, which has been largely neglected in scholarship, and not just Jewish scholarship, but you could say in large, the Mediterranean world in general, was crucial for understanding the transitions of modernity. In the case of North Africa, of course, this accelerated during colonial rule. Yaron's work avoids resorting to monolithic or standard assumptions about the traditional of Jewish societies on the eve of modern times, but rather writes on internal stratification against the context of North African society more generally. And as many of you know and have mentioned, uses the concept of sectional or sectoral instead of the much more problematic idea of social class to talk about Jewish communities and the leaders of the Jewish communities, which has allowed, I think, a much more nuanced history of the encounter of Jews with modernity and their transformations in the modern world, a history in which the mass immigration to Israel is not simply the end point, as it's often been portrayed historically in the sort of the older historiography. And so even in his Kehillah Keruah, that examines Morocco's post-World War II history, which ends in 1954, it's really the context of late colonialism and decolonization and the social and economic hierarchies and identities within the Jewish community that are the focus of his study, not the more teleological approach of mass migration or aliyah that has characterized many studies. This is the sense of the long history that makes legible the modern history of the Jews from Muslim countries. It is not a history that romanticizes the medieval world of Jewish civilization and Islam, from which the Mizrahim have been disinherited, figuratively speaking, a tendency in some scholarship, but a history of transformations of Jewish and Muslim societies that can better explain also the immigration history and experience of Mizrahim in Israel. It gives Jews from very diverse backgrounds also agency that is derived also from this longer history. And of course, also thinking about Mizrahim in Israel. So this was really my thinking that motivated my contribution to this volume. I wanted not only to write about the history of Moroccan Jews prior to the era of mass emigration, which most of my work has dealt with, but how and in what ways this history has been remembered and written about after the departure of most Jews from Muslim countries. I also wanted to talk about it as a dynamic process of memory making and writing in conjunction with social, political, and cultural developments, again, not only in Israel, but in Morocco as well, which for a variety of political and cultural reasons has remained connected to the Moroccan Jewish diaspora. The continued, or perhaps rather renewed, connections of Moroccan Jews to their country of origin and birthplaces and to the Moroccan monarchy is often portrayed as exceptional compared to Jews from other Muslim countries. And exceptional it is. It's not my interest to deflate the exceptionality of Morocco, in which so many Moroccans, and here we're talking about Muslims and Jews, take much pride. Rather, how has this exceptionality been portrayed and why? The Moroccan monarchy itself has played a big role in fostering this exceptionality by heralding its special relationship with the Jews, making the claim that it is the only country in the Arab world to take pride in its Jewish heritage. The story of Muhammad V saving Jews during World War II is constantly invoked as a symbol of the country's benevolence towards its Jewish citizens. Moroccan Jews are also important players in promoting the idea of Moroccan exceptionality with the reassertion also of pride of origins and their special relationship to the Moroccan monarchy. Of course, other communities from the Muslim world in Israel, like Moroccan Jews, have also reaffirmed pride in their heritage after a period of rejection and denial that often accompanied their, part of their immigration process, Israel. But what set apart Moroccan Jews is the fact that thousands began to visit their places of origin, including the second generation as well. And this has been actively encouraged by the monarchy itself, which makes the claim over the loyalty of the Moroccan Jewish diaspora, and who by law are considered Moroccan nationals. This solicitousness of the Moroccan Jewish community by the monarchy has become a cornerstone of Moroccan foreign policy as a manner to represent itself as a moderate and democratic state, and to mobilize the Moroccan Jewish diaspora as advocates for Morocco and the monarchy. In Israel, the assertion of the Moroccanness in the public sphere with, for example, the celebration of the Mimuna as a national event, well known, I'm sure, to all of you, together with the veneration and fidelity to the monarchy, to the Moroccan monarchy, symbolized by the unique defense of the Jews during World War II, Moroccan Jews' own Holocaust story, if you will, has been empowering for a community with a history of marginalization in Israeli society. Of course, historical memory is often contradictory, ambivalent, and heterogeneous. This was certainly the case with Moroccan Jews, even when there is general agreement on Moroccan exceptionality. One important example, perhaps, to illustrate this is the Mellah. Again, familiar to all of us as something kind of Moroccan, Jewish, right? It's but it's also closely associated to the idea of Moroccan exceptionality, right? And its uniqueness. For some, the Mellah is remembered nostalgically as a place of where Jews and Jewish culture thrived, and where Jews coexisted with their Muslim neighbors. For others, it was a place of oppression, where Jews were confined and were subject to periodic pillaging. In that sense, Jews were exceptional in their misery. Thus, in memory making of Moroccan Jews' long history, there are two contrasting images. Morocco as a haven for Jews, a haven which was protected by the monarchy historically as well, or Morocco as a place of persecution. And the two, which I argue, are interdependent. For being part of a history of persecution and experiencing, let's say, exceptionally harsh conditions can legitimize Moroccan ethnicity in Israel, while at the same time as part of a persecution narrative, you might say. While at the same time, Moroccan exceptionality in Israel is affirmed by the continued connection to their ancestral homeland, remembering the more harmonious life there, all encouraged by the much beloved monarchy. These contrasting historical memories of the Moroccan exception mirror each other and shape both the making of Moroccan ethnicity, but also the historiography and the history writing of the long history of Moroccan Jews. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Schreiter. And now I will pass to our third speaker, Emanuela Trevisan-Semi, that now has the floor.
Good evening to everybody, and many thanks for organizing this event to Dario and Aviad. I will speak about the fundamental work of Yaron Sur, because Yaron Sur has written many important and fundamental works and articles, but the book Keila Croix is a seminal text for any research one intends to undertake on the Jews of Morocco in contemporary times. And I wonder why it has not been translated into English. I think it would be very important for scholars who do not have access to Hebrew, like Moroccan historians, for example. So as far as I know, but maybe a translation is ready and I am not aware of this. As I said, Keila Croix remains a very rich work, and it's a treasure of sources, insights, information, analytical skills. Just think to the concept of sectorialization, Mizrahim, of the Moroccan Jewish society, which for anyone who has done research among the Jews of Morocco is of an illuminating evidence. I will limit myself here to pointing out a few examples from this book that were most relevant to me and to my research. The first example takes us inside a room just outside the Mellah of Casablanca in the 50s, following the memories of Arman Atedki, then a young boy living in the Mellah and whose father had a small bakery outside the old city. Those were the years of the rise of Arab nationalism in Morocco. Zur analyzes a story that takes place inside a room just outside the Mellah in the Arab part, also inhabited by Jews. In this room, at the end of Shabbat, a young man, Musa, an egg seller, and other Jewish neighbors used to meet. In this case, there was Musa's wife, the young Arman, his mother, and Esther. The sentences quoted, Zur warns us, are therefore representative of a section of the Jewish population that is not the poorest in the Mellah. The young Armand is asked to read what was written in an article in French, in which a picture of King Muhammad V in a white galabia appeared. The title, translated by the young man, spoke of the exile of the Sultan and his family to the island of Madagascar as a response to anti-French activity and to the desire for independence. Yaron Sur describes the bewilderment that occurs after this reading among those in the room, showing their ignorance of geography. Madagascar, where is it? But the focus immediately shifts to the word independence. What does it matter where Madagascar is, says Musa. Independence they want. When have the Arabs ever been independent? Without the French, this country will go back to what it was before they came, instability, hunger, and epidemics. Musa goes on and recognizes that the exile of the Sultan is a big mistake. Muslims love their king, he says, who is a descendant of the Prophet, and he has the impression that this will not be good for the French. But Esther adds, why don't you say that we Jews also love the Sultan? To this sentence, Musa's wife, who is afraid of her husband, says, this country belongs to the Muslims, not to us. Musa angrily summed up the brief discussion by saying, the country belongs to the French. This brief story, so emblematic of the conflicting feelings that stirred the inhabitants of the Mellah in the 50s, echoed my own field in Meknes and the plurality of voices that emerged when I raised the issue of departures. During an interview with the family of the mayor of Meknes, the mayor's wife answered to my question about departures, telling that the Jews had gone to Palestine and that Aaron, one of their neighbors, had said, we are leaving for our country, Bledna, in Palestine. The woman's mother then interfered. They didn't say Palestine, they said Israel. To which two other women in the room added, it's the same thing, only they said Israel and not Palestine. The issue of which country was a Jews' country, Morocco or Israel, Palestine, is still very much alive in Morocco, revealing the uncertainty about the status of Jews and the recognition of the complexity of feelings towards the virtual homeland and the homeland of birth. Meanwhile, France has disappeared from the narratives. Yaron Sur's ability to refer to examples that are illuminating and then to discuss them in depth is a great skill. This anecdote condensed many of the positions that prevailed among Jews at the time. But Yaron goes on to explain that the dialogue revealed that a young Arman, a pupil at the Alliance school, could read French, unlike the others in the room. Musa, who clearly did not know French, is the one who reacts most with anti-Arab hate and pro-French sympathies, despite the fact that his relations were with Jews and Muslims, but not with French. Yaron Sur tries to explain Musa's attitude, which was characterized by other small acts of spite towards the Arab landlord, whom Armand depicted as helpful and kind. Yaronsour rightly traces Musa's behavior to a more general question of power. Power that Muslims had over Jews and the weak position in relation to Muslims, among which Jews found themselves as a minority. A weakness that was felt to be less threatening with the arrival of the French. It was therefore the fact of feeling slightly safer, thanks to the French presence, that made Musa become absolutely pro-French, to the point of claiming that Morocco belongs to French. This did not affect feelings towards the Sultan, who was felt to be a protective presence by the Jews of the Melech, a guarantee. Armand Atedgi recalls in a later passage that during the Sultan's exile, the Jews also went out at night to search the moon for the face of Muhammad V, just like all the other Muslims in Morocco. Zur adds that if there were contrasting attitudes towards the Sultan in Morocco society, because for some he represented a religious identity, and for others he was an obstacle to the struggle for modern nationalism, this contrast was lacking in the context of the Melech. But who were the French really, wondered Armand? Who knew the Muslims best? Only that ignorance, Zur adds, was not enough to make people hate the French as much as the Muslims were hated. Through the memories of a young Jew from the Melech, Zur succeeds in bringing to light the colonial hierarchy that was imposed on the Jews of Morocco and that was also transmitted through the Alliance schools. Yet the story was even more complicated. Armand's recollections show that Jews and Muslims used to meet together in a convivial manner, playing cards all night, joking together, even about each other's religious beliefs, a reality I was able to witness personally during my research in 2005-06. And that one of the Muslims who took part in these meetings, an anti-French activist, warned Armand's father of one of the actions against the French and invited him to take refuge in his home. But this, Zur well explains, was not enough to create common feelings of national identification as a basis of identity consciousness. A consciousness that for Jews was based on Morocco past history. So this became an obstacle to participating in a Jewish-Muslim national movement for Jews belonging to popular sectors. And for Jews, the risk of a return to a Muslim government meant a descent in the hierarchy of the social ladder. I wanted to describe this part at length because it's a good example of Yaronsour's way of fabricating history, starting from individual stories. The pages that recount the events of Oujda and Gerada are also masterful pieces because they take into account the feelings of the lowest strata of the Jewish population, those who felt less defended and who were the smallest and most isolated places in Morocco. To the discomfort of the difficult economic situation was thus added the physical fear and the question of security, according to Yaronsour. Using another interesting source, Zur takes the opportunity to underline the contrasting representation of that period because while Jews felt like pariahs in Morocco, there in Israel, Jews were victorious over their enemies, and it was very difficult to reconcile these opposed narratives. Zur rightly identifies the impact that the events of Oujda and Gerada had on the Jewish population in Morocco as a turning point in the history of the following years. The description of the feelings of pride and redemption that Israel's victory provoked in comparison to with the local situation of insecurity brought me back to interviews I did on the situation following the aftermath of the 67 war, and which echoed what Yaronsour wrote about the years 47-48. In the interviews I did on the Jewish side, I was told about the father of one of the interviews, a lawyer, who every day proudly moved on his desk paws representing the Israeli advance in the war during the war 67. And on Muslim side, the former dean of the Faculty of Fes, who told me how Muslims found it hard to believe that Jews who in Morocco did not defend themselves and did not dare to speak, in Israel could, in a very short time, defeat free Arab armies, a fact that constituted a tremendous shock for Muslims in Morocco. Yaron Sur's interpretations referring to the end of the 40s were still relevant 20 years later. The pages on the activity of the Eliata Noor, which in the logic of redemption and unification of the diaspora did not care about the future consequences of separating children from their families and sending them to Israel, and the fractures that could occur in the families themselves, also offer us interesting insights into those events. Many novels written by former Jewish Morocco children brought up by the Eliata Noor to Israel recently came back to that difficult chapter in the history of migration from Morocco. These are just a few examples among many others from a seminal book that I wanted to mention because they are extraordinarily important for any future research. So thanks, Yaron, for all your work. Thanks.
And thank you, Emanuela, for this close reading of Keila Kroa, A Torn Community, one of the most important book of Yaron Sur, as you mentioned. I will now introduce the two following speakers. The first is Professor Jessica Marglin, who is Associate Professor of Religion, Law and History and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. Jessica earned her PhD from Princeton and her BA and MA from Harvard, and her research focuses on the history of Jews and Muslims in North Africa and the Mediterranean, with a particular emphasis on law. And she's the author of Across Legal Lines, Jews and Muslims in Modern Morocco, published by Yale University Press. The following speaker is Professor Ethan Katz, that is currently Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, after teaching at the University of Cincinnati and as visiting at the Hebrew University. He's a specialist of France and the Francophone world, and his research interests include Jewish-Muslim relations, Jews and in colonial societies, and Holocaust studies. His first monograph was published in 2015, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France. And he is the co-editor of Colonialism and the Jews, and Jews and Muslims in France before and after Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher. And at the moment, he's working on a new book project entitled Freeing the Empire, the Uprising of Jews and Anti-Semites that helped win World War II, focusing on the Jewish underground in Algiers during World War II. So I will give the floor to the first of these two last speakers, Jessica Marglin.
Hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively short so that we have enough time for discussion and for any questions that there might be. And I'll just say that I think that the premise of this volume, well, first of all, that obviously the premise of editing a volume in honor of Yaron Sur is incredibly, was to me, I think, incredibly welcome. I couldn't agree with Emanuela more that Keila Kroa was one of these incredibly important books, but that, you know, not enough people read outside of the Israeli context. And I want to speak a little bit about my contribution to the book and how I see it sort of fitting into broader historiographical discussions about how we write the history of, again, this complicated term, Mizrahi Jews or Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, and how we connect the history of Jews in North Africa and the Middle East to the history of North African and Middle Eastern Jews who end up in Israel post 48. And I want to sort of, make my argument a little bit simpler for the sake of time and perhaps for the sake of provocation. I want to suggest that law and legal history can be a really powerful way in which to rethink the sort of traditional boxes into which we put Jewish history and the ways in which the history of Mizrahim in particular has been often sort of siloed off from other parts of Jewish history. I think, the Aviad said briefly something about sort of the ways in which work on Jewish legal history is often subsumed under the umbrella of Mishpat Ivri, or Hebrew law, which is this category that was invented in the 20th century and is very much part of the sort of Zionist attempt to reclaim Jewish law for a modern nation state. And when I say legal history, I definitely don't mean the sort of Mishpat Ivri approach, but rather a legal history that takes Jewish legal texts, and admittedly they're written by elites, by rabbis, usually by men, but nonetheless, I think that they can be incredibly powerful for helping us rethink how to write a Jewish history that is trans-regional as opposed to sort of exclusively identitarian. So the chapter that I wrote for this volume has to do with a larger project that I'm finishing up now, which is about a Jewish man named Nissim Shamama, who was from Tunisia and who died in Italy, in Livorno, so on the other side of the peninsula. But nonetheless, it seems appropriate to speak about an Italian case study in this forum hosted by Ca' Foscari. His name was Nissim Shamama. He died in 1873, and there was a long legal battle over his estate, which I'm not going to get into today because we don't have time. But certainly I have a lot to say about it in other contexts. What I want to focus on is the legal debate over his will. So he wrote a will, which was written in Judeo-Arabic, which is the only language that he was literate in. He spoke Arabic, but he almost certainly didn't read the Arabic alphabet, as most Jews did not in North Africa in the 19th century. And there was a big debate about the validity of Nissim Shamama's will according to halakha, according to Jewish law. And rabbis from across the Mediterranean weighed in on this. And it's because the debates about Nissim's will span the Mediterranean that I think it can offer a kind of counterpoint to the way that historians have typically divided up the Jewish world. So generally, a Jew like Nissim Shamama is confined to sort of Tunisian Jewish history or North African Jewish history, Mizrahi Jewish history. And Italian Jews are usually lumped with Europe, right? So that's, Italy is sort of seen part of Europe. And of course, Jews in 19th century Eretz Yisrael in Palestine tend to be sort of part of Israel studies or part of the sort of prehistory of Israel. And I think that what the Shamama case can do is remind us that these divisions don't necessarily actually fit the way that Jews live their lives, and definitely don't fit the way that Jewish law worked, because Jewish law often, not always, but often sort of, strongly transcended these categories and ignored these boundaries that we historians tend to like to use. And I'll just very quickly sort of set up some of the terms of the debate. So the debate over Nissim's will begins very shortly after he dies. And the first rabbi to write a teshuvah or a responsum on it is Avraham Ashkenazi, who is the Rishon LeZion, the chief Sephardic rabbi in Jerusalem. And he writes this very sort of traditional teshuvah, but he argues for the will being valid, which is a sort of less obvious way to go for various reasons. And then shortly after his teshuvah is published, a rabbi who also lives in Jerusalem, but who's from the Ashkenazi community, he was actually born in Belarus, his name was Yaakov Sapir, wrote a sort of competing teshuvah, which argued the opposite, which argued that the will was not valid according to halakha. And again, Sapir uses very kind of traditional modes of arguing. And then the debate sort of extends particularly to rabbis in Tunisia, but not only. And the final phase is this long drawn out sort of intellectual battle between not rabbis, one rabbi and one Jewish studies professor in Italy, both from Livorno. The Jewish studies professor was named David Castelli. He taught in Firenze in Florence. And the rabbi was named Elia ben Amozeg. He's a very well-known figure, certainly among Italian Jews of the 19th century. He was a mystic and a philosopher and wrote extensively on sort of Judaism and universalism. And they also wrote sort of opinions on the case, although not in the traditional form of a response. And they wrote in Italian, and they were writing really for the audience of the Italian courts that were adjudicating the case. And in this sense, it's interesting because David Castelli, who was an atheist and who was cremated after his death, and who was, thoroughly infused by the Wissenschaft des Judentum mindset, wrote a very kind of traditional approach to the will, saying that it was not valid according to Jewish law and using all these sort of traditional interpretations of Jewish sources. Whereas Elia ben Amozeg, who was a self-identified Orthodox rabbi, who wrote at first extensively in Hebrew, wrote this long opinion on the case in which he argues not only that it was valid according to Jewish law, but he makes these very kind of innovative arguments about the need to reinterpret Jewish law at every generation, about the ways in which Jewish law must change, about the fact that the texts like Shulchan Aruch really aren't that important because it was just some rabbi's opinion, and the only really important texts are the Talmud and the Mishnah. So the tracing of these debates as they play out, which I've hopefully just given you a taste of, but I won't go into in great detail for the sake of leaving us time to discuss, I think give us a sense that these divisions between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim are not as eternal and essential as they're often assumed. Obviously, there were differences, but I think there were ways in which sometimes Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, or Sephardim and Ashkenazim, really found themselves on the same side of a debate, on the same side of a particular divide, and that they were sort of, separated from Jews who were both Ashkenazim or Mizrahim. And then finally, and this is maybe going to be an obvious point for all of the Italians and scholars of Italian Jewish history in the room, or the Zoom room, but I think it's worth saying that the fact that the case happens in Italy, and the fact that Italy is kind of the node of these legal debates, is not necessarily just sort of happenstance, because Italy never fits in to these identitarian categories, right? Italian Jews are Sephardi, some of them are Ashkenazi, some of them are neither, they're just sort of Italian, and they're extremely connected, especially a place like Livorno is deeply connected to Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews across North Africa and the Middle East, especially North Africa, because there are these robust communities of Livornese Jews, Grana Jews in places like Tunisia and Algeria. And so in some ways, what I think we get is this perspective of Jewish history that is more Mediterranean than Mizrahi or Sephardi or Ashkenazi, and that can help us maybe rethink the ways in which these categories have sort of assumed a kind of distinctiveness of the Mizrahi experience, both pre-Israel and then once in Israel, that maybe needs to be re-examined. And in this sense, I think that elite discussions about law can help us do that. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jessica, for these interesting intervention and also for these last remarks, which I very much agree with. But I also do not want to take any time to the last speaker, that is Professor Ethan Katz, to which I will now give the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Dario, and thank you so much to the organizers. Always a pleasure and a challenge to follow my dear friend Jessica, and really an honor to be on this panel. It's a wonderful opportunity to honor the work of Yaron, a scholar who has done so much important work in this field and who is very dear to me personally. So I'm just going to say a word about Yaron's scholarship and a bit about what remains so novel and important about it, and how the imprint of that is felt both in the pages of this terrific Fetschrift book and in my own work there, and particularly my current research, of which that is a part. I want to suggest broadly that maybe Yaron's most important legacy and I guess I'm partly projecting hopes here, is his eschewing of polemics in a field that has been often defined by polemics, both historiographical and political. Now, the book, the long history of the Mizrahim, is an unusual book for many reasons, and one of them that's been spoken about a little bit is the fact that it has a lot of content both about Jews of the MENA in Islamic lands and about those Jews as they came to Israel. This is extremely rare, and I'll just take a couple of examples briefly of books that I am fond of. One is the book Jewish Culture and Society of North Africa, edited by Emily Gottrich and Daniel Schreiter. Another is a book that I co-edited, Colonialism and the Jews. Each of these are books that deal at great length with Jews of the MENA and that do not deal with their next chapter, their destiny in Israel. In the case of our book, Colonialism and the Jews, we have a whole section on Zionism and colonialism, but even that section says almost nothing about Mizrahi Jews in Israel. When I did an event for this book, as some of you will recall who were there in Israel a few years ago, Yaron was there, and Yaron critiqued the book on that score, and I think that he was very much right to do so. And so I think that it's important to recognize that Yaron's work was really pioneering also in thinking about the condition of Mizrahi Jews in Israel as part of a longer history. And there's to my mind, a wonderful essay that he wrote in the Cambridge History of the Jews for the Modern Period called Colonial and Post-Colonial Jewries, the Middle East and North Africa, where he explicitly talks about the condition of Mizrahim in Israel as part of a condition of being post-colonial, right? Now, he wrote this essay. I'm sure the editors did not necessarily expect him to extend that history into Israel. Most sort of synthetic essays about Jews of the MENA do not say more than maybe a paragraph at the end about migration and destinations of migration, and that's where they stop. Yaron devotes the last couple of segments, the last couple of sections of this essay to the situation of Mizrahim in Israel. He draws a really interesting comparison between the encounter that they have there with earlier encounters between Eastern and Western Jews. He points out this is a much more sustained and widespread encounter than, say, with the Alliance or other Jews from Europe who came on a so-called civilizing mission to Eastern lands. But he also says that this is important because it's not a colonial encounter per se, but rather a national one. And it's full of marginalization and discrimination, but he argues it's easier to break through in a national context for these Mizrahi Jews than it was in a colonial context because of legal differences and structural differences in those two systems. And I think that that's a really important intervention. I'm kind of just saying this parenthetically because our time is short, but because Yaron is not a polemicist, he doesn't use this point about national versus colonial to hammer at those who have been very polemical about the question of the so-called Arab Jew. But I think there's a profound insight there that problematizes the terms of that entire debate. How he gets to this approach to Mizrahi Jews who come to Israel is in part out of the sectorial approach that he takes, which has been referred to earlier. I've been in conversation with Yaron about this for years, and as he has explained in writing and to me in conversation, he came to the idea of sectors in part because the notion of class, which was so dominant historiographically when thinking about societal divisions, when he was first writing, the notion of class didn't fit the situation of Jews in the MENA and particularly in colonial societies in the MENA. So he rejected Marxism as a framework. And I would just point out again, Marxist historiography obviously has been incredibly important and incredibly insightful in numerous fields, but it is very often fundamentally a highly polemicized mode of writing about history, both from political and historiographical vantage points. And I think that part of the success of Yaron's work, again, comes from a decision to step out of that and to employ the sectorial framework, right? So for me, in my own work on the Algiers underground during World War II, I have found this sectorial framework to be incredibly useful, particularly in combination with certain historiographical paradigms from what is more my original home turf of European historiography. I'm something of an interloper here still, because that is where my training really began and was rooted for a long time. There's been a long-standing debate about the Jews of Algeria on a variety of issues, and in part a debate about their power or powerlessness vis-a-vis the French colonial state, because of the fact that they were emancipated in 1870 when they received citizenship, 88 years before citizenship was given en masse to their Muslim neighbors. And at the same time, they faced significant anti-Semitism in colonial Algerian society and were never fully accepted in the European context. And that debate is part of what inflects a more specific debate about the Algiers underground that I'm writing about now, which has been about whether it was more of a French, quote unquote, or a Jewish, quote unquote, resistance movement. As I started to look at Yaron's framework of sectors, where he argues that we have the native sector, the so-called Western sector, and the European sector that reflect different kind of levels of rootedness, either in native Arab Muslim society or full integration and assimilation toward a colonial European society. When I started to think about that, I realized this actually tells us a great deal about Jews in Algeria, specifically the complexity of their position, and for the case of the insurrection, where these Jews came from and how it was that they came to be involved in a network that ultimately carries out, arguably the most important Jewish resistance movement, strategically speaking, of the Second World War. And this combined for me with the idea of a Jewish subculture, which came from my first mentor in Jewish history, David Sorkin, and his work on German Jewry. And there, David Sorkin argues that we have to understand German Jews in the 19th century as a group that attempted to assimilate, but ultimately, because of barriers in German society, ends up recreating a lot of the different institutions and modes of living of wider German society into specifically Jewish guise. So burial societies, all kinds of associational life that they try to create on the sort of to mirror bourgeois German society, ends up always being defined by Jewishness, because they're basically populated by Jews, they're made for Jews. And if we look at Algerian society for the majority of Jews who are living there by the early 20th century, we see something in some ways very parallel. These Jews, they consider themselves very French. They're very proud to be French. They have linguistically integrated. They often retain Judeo-Arabic in their homes, and they often retain separate Jewish names for life cycle events, but they've changed their first names to French names generationally in public, and they see themselves in public as primarily French rather than Arabic in their culture. They maintain important ties commercially often and in neighborhoods to their Muslim colleagues, and they're not, by and large, widely accepted by the colonists because of the persistence of anti-Semitism there. And so they end up creating a kind of very Jewish social and associational life in that context, even though they consider themselves consistently French, in many cases consistently European. So when I thought about them in what Yaron calls the Western sector as a kind of subculture of the wider European segment of colonial society, I began to see what they had in common, particularly those who participate in the underground. Many of them come from the same associations. Many of them come from the same neighborhoods. They are very often in networks with the people who take part in the underground. Sometimes they didn't know that their sibling even, or their neighbor, or someone that they had been close to in another context was also part of the underground as part of another cell. But we see, I'm doing sort of sectorial analysis inspired by your own, we see how much overlap there is in these networks. And so we end up realizing that, Jews they're not, they're part of a subculture that really shapes their choices here. They do consider themselves insistently French, but we can't really imagine their participation in the underground without understanding that subculture as part of primarily the Western sector, to use Yaron's terminology. And it also means that Jews are not on one side or the other of a power dynamic. They're caught in a multi-ethnic, multifaceted society. In some ways, their subculture is not just of the European sector, but also of the native sector. And then this is what produces their uprising. And I have a lot more to say. Obviously, I'm writing a book about it. But I think that this is where we find social reality in all of its messiness. And that's where we find a Jewish history of the MENA that is always, for Yaron Sur, at once usefully categorized, and, to use the phrase that many critics describe the great jazz musician Duke Ellington with, also beyond category. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan, for your presentation. And so this was the end of this second section of our discussion. We are now moving towards the end. That, aside from the Q&A, also include before that actually some final remarks by Professor Yaron Sur himself that should be shortly introduced by Noach Gerber. I can give the floor to Noach, and I then try to identify Yaron in the room so that he can open the microphone and video.
Okay, so I've just, these were all fascinating talks. I would just like to dwell a bit on Daniel Schreiter and Eitan Katz's remarks to sort of introduce Yaron by saying that he continues to straddle the history of Jews in Islamic lands and Mizrahim by way of the long history. And I would also like to add that, while perhaps not on this evening, Yaron, before he arrived at Tel Aviv University, was also a very important founding faculty member of the Open University of Israel. He developed, I would say, the first mass course in Jewish history for Israelis who, in the 1970s at least, had no access to 7 universities. Now there are 8, 9, I stopped counting. But I will also add that in recent years, Yaron's main project has been, in fact, those centuries, I would say the Black centuries that Daniel was hinting at, specifically the beginning of the era of decline. Yaron has tackled that in a Hebrew language monograph that appeared several years ago with Mossad Bialik, and an English edition with Littman is forthcoming, we hope. And this basically is a new typology of Jewish leadership in Islamic lands, specifically in the Ottoman East, in the heartland of the empire, and in the North African provinces. There will be a companion volume, which has not yet appeared in Hebrew either, which will of course include a very important section on Morocco. And I won't elaborate on this typology because it's fascinating, and I think we should let Yaron himself speak and address us and have his say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be very happy to let Yaron speak, but unfortunately, I think he's using a username which is not his name, so I don't know whose microphone and video I have to open, unless I open the audio and micro to everybody else in the room.
Right, that makes sense.
So that's what
Yeah, why won't you just go ahead and do that, because
yeah.
Yaron needs to speak. Yeah.
Okay. So now I opened the audio and micro. So to anyone who's here. So I guess while we managed to do this, I mean, any Zoom always has some problems, as we've learned over the last year. I just wanted to say that I also very much enjoyed the discussion so far. We have a couple of comments in the chat that we can take later, or maybe now. I don't know.
Perhaps now, since I think I can't explain why. I think he is trying to identify himself for the sake of responding.
No, okay. Okay. If he's here, he can just open the.
I told him to open his mic, and
okay, thank you.
I can't of the names that appear here. I just don't know which is his.
I know, yeah, but he should be able to do that by himself now, because
for sure.
The audience. So I just wanted to say that there were a couple of comments from the beginning of our discussion that remarked the difficulty of Israeli sociology, history, and Israeli academic world more generally to acknowledge, let's say, the history and culture of the Mizrahim, of the Jews of the Arab world in the first phase, let's say, of Israeli academia, and even in more recent years, one could argue to some extent.
Well, I can respond to that in brief. I believe that Professor Harvey Goldberg's comments pretty much covered that issue, but I will just add that Aviad and myself elaborated on this in our introduction, specifically that there was actually an interest in Mizrahim in the Yishuv, contrary to the comments that were offered. It was more, I would say, of a curatorial interest, literally creating museum exhibits, and you should use your imagination. S.D. Goitein's idea of creating a live Yemenite reservation as early as 1932 in the Jüdische Rundschau, of all places, that speaks for itself. And even Goitein, who was considered such a friend of the Yemenite community, so romanticized them that he, in a sense, ended up, and I hope I'm not assaulting, I hope I'm not losing friends here, ended up creating a very unhistorical framing of Yemenite Jewry, which actually continued to serve him well when he relocated to the United States and became primarily went into Cairo Geniza studies. So there was, in fact, I would not say that, and to be sure, Oriental or Mizrahi Jews made up 20% of the Yishuv. And at the beginning of the British Mandate, by the way, they made up 40%. In the collection, we have a fascinating article by Gurel Ri, currently the rector of Haifa University, who demonstrates that while there were immigrations to Palestine, to the Yishuv from Islamic countries, they were very, very small, quite small. And the primary incoming of Ashkenazi migrants, initially from Poland, subsequently from Germany in the 1930s, overshadowed them considerably. And only recently has the historiography caught up with this. But I will say I've said enough, and I hope that we can now hear from Yaron himself. Aviad is
Yeah, we're trying to solve this technical issue. Yaron is going to log in through his wife's account, so I'm taking care of this now. If you want to take more Q&As while I'm
if
dealing
there are
with
any
this.
more questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. I mean, if someone has comments to you, or write in the chat, or I just, if while we wait for possible comments, I just wanted to say something that came to my mind hearing Jessica Marglin speaking about these, the role that Italy may have, and also I was thinking that in many ways. The case of Shamama on which Jessica is working is a very interesting example that helps us redrawing the boundaries, let's say, between the Middle East and Europe, between North Africa and Europe, focusing precisely on the Mediterranean as a kind of liquid continent, as some French scholar of the 1920s, Gabriel Odizio, called it, and as a kind of space that can be, of course, a fracture, but can also connect, and in depending on how we look at it and which period we focus on. Then I don't know again if someone some of the speaker wants to add something, or anyone else here, while we wait for Yaron to give his final remarks.
Waiting room.
Okay,
Aviad Moreno says
Moreno is entering in the room, but maybe it's not him.
Let's
Maybe
hope it's
Yaron.
Yaron.
I don't know what's wrong here.
And I also wanted to say one last thing again while we wait, that the book, so far is in Hebrew, but as for Yaron's book, I also hope that Historia Rocha shel Mizrahim will be hopefully translated into English, or at least parts of it, I don't know, because that would be very helpful for scholars in the field that may not have access to Hebrew. Here he is. So.
Oh, great.
שלום, ערב טוב.
בבקשה, ירון. בבקשה. יופי. רגע, שאנחנו נעצור.
I was all the time, I was with you, and I didn't have the idea that there is any problem. So I apologize. I don't know for whom I should apologize, but I apologize. Thank you all for coming to this evening, and thank you, Dario, and to all the other organizers for organizing it. I'm grateful for you. It's interesting that in what you said, I find myself again and again dealing with the same things just in the last days. For instance, Daniel, you spoke about the long history. I started to think about not only, first of all, it's interesting to decide how long should the long history of Mizrahim should be. I dedicated a lot of time to discuss it with myself. one can think that it begins with, like Said, that it begins already with the Greeks. But I think that for the Jews, it begins when two things happens. First of all, what I call the internal Orientalism, that is a special type of Orientalism that is common among the Jews because the Jews are among the few populations in the world that they have a population in Europe and population in Asia or Africa. And that is something very special. And the second thing is exploitation economically. And here is, I don't remember who talked about Mizrahim. In the term Mizrahim is new. It's not in the sense that we use it today, and is the result of work of Shlomo. Shlomo Svirsky. He was a neo, and still is neo-Marxist, and he needed one term in order to represent all the olim from Islamic countries as one group. So he chose Mizrahim, and he succeeded in convincing journalists and others to use only this, and he succeeded. So there is a question not only of the longitude, but also the thickness of the history. And I am now, after my retirement, I'm with the thickness more than with the length, long length. I'd like to start saying a few things about my essential characteristics or whatever that pushed me to this niche of history of the Orientals. I was born in Jerusalem to a mixed family, that everybody knows, and I got such a Zionist about my society when I was about 20 years old. So I decided to go to Tunis because I learned something about Albert Memmi, to go to Tunis in order to understand my society, because I felt that in Tunis you find the relations that I saw in Albert Memmi's book. You see the relationships that you see in Jerusalem between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. And you see, I use the Shlomo Svirsky, Mizrahim. You could say Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. But this was only the beginning of the discovery. And the end of the discovery, you could see today now when I'm talking to you, when I understood in a certain moment that I am like this, the division in colonial societies, I am mitma'arev. I am somebody who is not European and who is not native. Because Israel includes European Jews and non-European Jews, Asian and African. And somebody like me that is an issue of mixed marriage must have this identity as he cannot be either Mizrahi or Ashkenazi. He must be something that has the characteristic of the two of them. Now, if you can't be European, you cannot speak English as all the people here use it. And you can talk like me in Anglit elegant. Of course, you can speak much better than myself. I didn't invest enough time and money in learning English better. I can read about 5 or 6 languages, but speak. I prefer to speak in Hebrew, only in Hebrew. Now, the problem of hybridity is something that gives you a lot of power and a lot of disillusionment and a lot of mystery. And I actually wanted to bring you today something that I wrote today, something about Shabtai Tzvi and about the Ottoman Empire and about the term about the term that means treaty. And this is the term treaty is what this is a frame, a sociological and legal and religious frame that the Islam gave for non-Muslims in his territories. I wanted to bring it to you because it also is connected to things that were told here about my itinerary, my studies itinerary, and my studies of what from where I went to where. I find myself now in the phase of getting to know the most important political unity in your field. And this is the Ottoman Empire. So I started with ethnic problem in Israel, went to Tunis and studied North Africa, went to there, and then I started to go to the different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And all this because I was not happy, I was not calm, I was not easygoing with my hybridity. I know that you can feel that I'm a little bit or too much excited now. So it's difficult for me to talk. But first of all, I want again to thank all of you for coming to this evening and to promise you that I'm trying to do my best, even in my state, and to tell you that what you said about me, I can say about most of you. I mean, like reading and enjoying somebody else's page of history. No, it's easier for me to speak about my recent students because we passed this. David is here. David Gage. He's the last one that I enjoyed this page of writing history. I mean, that's so important what you said, Manuela. I think that, I'm not the first to think that writing history is writing literature. And it's a kind of literature. So it's not difficult to expect that the text in history will be written in such a way that they will cause you pleasure. And it's so rare. And I just finish by saying that if we should not learn to write in a way that our products will be used as economic detail and will not be able to bring big money, I'm afraid that our profession will go down and down. And thank you again for coming, and see you later. להתראות.
Thank you, Yaron, for these beautiful words, and I also wish you and all of us להתראות very soon. Hopefully next time in person and not just on Zoom, in Israel or elsewhere.
Or in Venice.
Yes, and so I don't see any comments, so I don't know, Aviad, maybe we can close our session if you want to add some final words.
I think much has been said. I learned so much today from each one of you, by the way, including about my technical skills. As I was struggling to help Yaron enter, I learned a lot about our field today, and I really enjoyed your talks. And I hope we can really, have another round of discussions about the way we should further take this field into a more globalized context. I'm looking at, the trans-regional context that Jessica is dealing with, and other things that many of you are working on. And I'm really excited and looking forward to see what will come out in the next decades. So thank you so much, everybody. Really, I really enjoyed it, and yeah, see you next time.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you
So much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.